Okay, in this video, we're continuing our discussion of ARC Section 90A for the review of financial statements. And in the last video, we discussed preparing a plain vanilla accountant's review report. And so for this video, we'll discuss the modifications we need to make to that report to put it in line with if our financial statements we reviewed were prepared in accordance with a special purpose framework. So the plain vanilla accountant's review report considers that the financial statements were prepared under a general purpose framework, for instance, GAAP. But if the financial statements were prepared under a special purpose framework, for instance, the cash basis or a regulatory basis, something like that, then we need to make a few modifications, and these sections tell us how to do that. And it's ARC Section 90A.40 through 44. Okay, so let's dive into these now. Okay, so before we get started in this one, I want to remind us about how in the video we discussed a while back regarding the engagement letter and agreeing to the terms of the engagement, we know that in our engagement letter, we needed to, if the financial statements were being performed in accordance with a special purpose framework, we needed the management to agree and acknowledge their responsibility that if they are preparing the financial statements in accordance with a special purpose framework, then they need to disclose in the notes to the financial statements a description of that financial reporting framework, a summary of the significant accounting policies that are used for the special purpose framework, an adequate description about the special purpose framework and how it differs from GAAP, and also some informative disclosures that are similar to those required by GAAP when there are certain items in the financial statements that are GAAP-like. So management acknowledged in our engagement letter their responsibilities for this if they're preparing the financial statements in accordance with a special purpose framework. And so if it turns out that they didn't include any of these disclosures in the notes of the financial statements, then we need to modify our review report to make that known. And in the same vein, if the notes of the financial statements don't include a description of the contractual basis of accounting, if that is the special purpose framework that the client is using, if those aren't disclosed in the notes of the financial statements, we also need to modify our report to reflect that also. And next, if the financial statements are prepared in accordance with a special purpose framework, then we need to include these two statements here, and that is that we should make reference to the management's responsibility for determining that this special purpose framework is acceptable, and we should also include in our report the purpose for which the financial statements are prepared, or at least refer to the note where that is discussed. And so, in addition, our accountant's review report should include an emphasis of a matter paragraph, and we should make an appropriate heading to declare that's what the paragraph's about. And this paragraph should include these three statements, and that is that the financial statements are prepared in accordance with an applicable special purpose framework, and we should refer to the note in the financial statements that describes the framework if they have provided that footnote. As we saw in this case, if they didn't provide that note or that footnote, then we need to make that known in our report as well. And finally, in our emphasis of a matter paragraph, we need to state that the special purpose framework is the basis of accounting other than GAAP. And finally, in accordance with ARC Section 90A.54, which we'll get to later, we're only at 44 now, and also with 61 through 62, the accountant's review report should include an other matter paragraph that has an appropriate heading that explains, or rather it restricts the use of the accountant's review report when the special purpose financial statements are prepared in accordance with a contractual basis of accounting, a regulatory basis of accounting, or an other basis of accounting when required pursuant to paragraph 61A through B. So we will get to those sections in a later video that will give us some more information on how to do that. But for now, we just need to understand that there might be an other matter paragraph in the situations when the special purpose framework is one of these. So we've got a lot of explanatory material here, and we can go down to those sections and read about it. So we also have some illustrative accountant's review reports that we can look at as well. So that's it. Explanatory sections A81 through 85. So let's go to those sections now. Okay, so here we're in the explanatory material for the accountant's review report when the financial statements are prepared with a special purpose framework. So we remember from the requirements we just discussed that the notes of the financial statements are supposed to include a description of the special purpose framework. And they're saying here that this might include the description of the financial statements as well. And because financial statement descriptions such as balance sheet, statement of financial position, etc., are normally associated with GAAP, we want to refrain from calling the statements items like these. We want to instead add statements of what basis of accounting are being applied at the end of them. For example, they've provided a few examples here. For the income statements, we might call it something like income statement modified cash basis or statement of cash receipts and disclosures. For the balance sheet, we might call it balance sheet tax basis or some other variation. If it's under the regulatory basis of accounting, we might we might say regulatory basis. And we remember from the requirements above that the footnotes of the financial statements are supposed to describe the difference between the special purpose framework and GAAP. And so they're noting here that we only need to make sure that those material differences are included. So we don't need to really concern ourselves with the small differences. And also, we remember that we are supposed to or the client is supposed to include in the footnotes of their financial statements similar disclosures to those required by GAAP if there are transactions or items that are the same as or similar to financial statements prepared in accordance with GAAP. So if they didn't include these items in the footnotes, we would have to modify our report to make that known. And next, as we remember, if the special purpose framework is a regulatory or contractual basis of accounting, then we would include a restriction in the accountant's review report pursuant to paragraph 61 and 42, which we'll get to later, or that at least refers to the footnote that discusses that restriction. It tells us here that our intention for doing that in our accountant's review report is to avoid misunderstandings when the financial statements are used for purposes other than those for which they were intended. Okay, so now that we've got an understanding of what all we need to do to modify the accountant's review report when the financial statements are prepared under a special purpose framework, let's go down to an illustrative accountant's review report when that is the situation. So let's go down to Exhibit C now. Okay, so now we're down in Exhibit C, the illustrations of the accountant's review reports. And we see here that this illustration 3 is an accountant's review report prepared in accordance with the tax basis of accounting. So that's a special purpose framework. So let's go down and take a look at that one and see how they've modified from the original plain vanilla accountant's review report. So we see here, as we saw in the explanatory material, they've added tax basis at the end of each of the financial statements, as they suggested. It also says that it says income tax purposes instead of GAAP, which was in the plain vanilla report. It also says that management is responsible for determining that that's the appropriate special purpose framework as well. And next we have the emphasis of a matter paragraph that they have appropriately named basis of accounting, and they're referring to the footnote X of the financial statements that tells about the basis of accounting used, and they tell us that that basis is an accounting principle other than GAAP. And since they didn't note that, or they didn't have a modification to the report, then we can assume that the footnotes in the financial statements adequately describes this basis of accounting, as well as how it's different from GAAP and the material accounting policies thereon. And so those are the main changes to the accountant's review report whenever we are preparing it under a special purpose framework.